Welcome, everyone, to the Clocking Out Podcast, a show about people who share their own personal journey that include making bold choices to clock out of situations to follow their dreams of career fulfillment and to live their best, most authentic lives. I am your host, Raymond Lee, and this podcast could not be possible without the support of Careerminds. Today, I am incredibly excited to welcome Bianca Sibiya. Bianca is the founder of the Fixer Coalition, a company she launched that partners with brands and agencies to optimize social, culture, and community integration to enable social selling across Africa. With extensive experience scaling African brands in fintech, media, broadcasting, fashion, and tech, Bianca is passionate about crafting culture-driven strategies that foster community and trust for African brands. As the former head of TikTok Africa operations, she played a key role in driving platform adoption, product education, and managed spokesperson engagements. Personally, I have to say, I learned so much from this conversation around African culture, business evolution, and the impact it had on Bianca's life and her journey. So without further ado, please enjoy Bianca Sibiya and her clocking out story. Bianca, welcome to the podcast. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Raymond, and to the Clocking Out community. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. I am so excited about our conversation today for a number of reasons. One, I was thinking about this over the last week now. We connected, I'd say like 2 months ago online. And the one thing that struck me was that you have your undergraduate degree in industrial psychology. And I have my graduate degree as well in industrial organizational psychology. And, I thought we had that connection and, really interested to learn more about what that was all about, but really excited about our conversation today.
You know what? I think in the journey of trying to select subjects, I had this epiphany that, yes, I'm studying kind of traditional psychology, but I didn't necessarily want to kind of dive into people's headspaces and fix people's brains. So I thought, you know what? The country's kind of moving from this kind of old kind of apartheid regime, and there's a lot of work to be done in terms of how the workforce is being enabled in ways that are fair business practices, and there's a lot of work to be done there. So I had this epiphany that I was going to help trade unions and help people get better pay. Yeah, but that was kind of a pipe dream. I mean, I loved the course, but I never took it further than that.
That's interesting. So when I started my undergrad, I wanted to be a therapist, and I started my degree in counseling psychology and realized I don't want to just solve people's problems. And so I transitioned to industrial psychology, which, similar to you, I felt like I would be solving the problems of people in the workplace. And ultimately that evolved into many different things. So I think we were in the similar mindset.
Yeah. And ironically, I now love psychology. Like it's the fundamental of everything that I do on a day-to-day basis professionally. So here we are, many years later, reflecting.
I love that. So Bianca, I'd love to just start from the beginning. Tell us, where'd you grow up, what your mom and dad did for a living, and we'll go from there.
So I'm your poster child for pretty much any average South African. Born in Durban during apartheid, in a very, very small town within Durban itself, where we were basically grouped together based on your race. So everybody around me was brown and black. There was no white people around me. I grew up with my parents, my grandparents, actually. So my parents divorced when I was 1. So I never really had the traditional experience of a mom and a dad growing up. My mother at the time was actually discovered working in a retail store, and she became a model. So she literally spent most of my childhood traveling the world. She got to get a passport during the apartheid era, which was like it was not something that was even remotely even issued. And she already had 2 kids, mind you. So it's myself and my older brother. And then my dad, obviously during the divorce, he kind of moved on. He was a mechanic, as I understand it. So that was kind of his forte. He was more of an engineer, very technically minded. My mother was more of a creative. So between the two of them, they produced us two human beings. And my grandparents raised me for the most part until I moved into Johannesburg and moved with my mother at the age of 13. So my formative years were really around, I guess, being raised by a generation that is very kind of different to what I was accustomed to at the time. And I'm so grateful for that, Yeah.
So I'm curious, what did you find yourself doing as a kid? What did you love to do?
I always think back to this summertime growing up in Durban. So for those who are not familiar with the place, it's a coastal city, right? Durban itself. I lived near the beach, but I never actually went there. And one of the things that was really popular during the summer season was mangoes, which I'm sure you're very aware of. So we used to find anything possible to be able to repurpose and create cool stuff that we could have. So one of the things that I loved doing was taking a mango pip and kind of taking out the center, taking off all the hairs on side of the pip and making little handbags. And we would basically create fashion out of everyday items that was trash, right? Because remember, growing up at the time, there wasn't a lot of money. My grandparents were basically retirees working in, my grandmother was kind of in the fashion space and my grandfather worked at a retail store. So they basically did what they could to survive and pay for my education. But I never had the luxury of a Barbie or roller skates or a skateboard or, kind of all the cool stuff that you had growing up as a kid, or Lego for that matter. So we did what we could with the stuff that we had around. So it was always going to the parks, hanging out at friends' houses and playing with trash, actually.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it sounds like at a young age you were quite industrious when
Yeah.
you think about what you were doing with mangoes and the creative side of things. Did you make money at it?
Oh, no.
Did you
I mean,
sell
I was
anything?
7, 8, 9. No, I mean, for more than anything else, it was purely just for the sake of being able to produce something. I mean, we did try to do random things like wash people's cars for money, but it wasn't really a thing. And I think because we're such a small, tight-knit community, you could pretty much walk into anybody's house and they would be able to give you something. So if you wanted sweets, somebody would give you a couple of coins to go and buy candy at the local store. But for the most part, there was never really kind of an entrepreneurial mindset at the time. I think our mothers and our grandmothers were the ones that were selling food and selling candy and trying to make additional streams of income. But for the kids, we lived a very kind of easy life. We had what we needed. We were happy. We had people around us to look after us. And we were raised by a community. So beyond the grandparents, my neighbors, the people at school, the teachers, everybody was all part of the collective of raising the community, which is so beautiful. We don't have that these days.
Yeah, I love that secure sort of community connection. And something that's oftentimes asked here in the States when you're young is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I wonder if that question was asked by your grandparents or people within the community. What does Bianca want to do when she grows up?
Yeah, so I recall being in grade 4 or 5 when they do those psychometric tests. And my results came back as I should either be a wood chopper or a veterinarian because I have empathy and passion for animals. Where that sat within my consciousness in terms of where I, kind of the person that I became, it didn't necessarily resonate. I always knew fundamentally that my existence on this earth is to be able to help people through the IP and the stuff that I know in my brain. And that was kind of where I kind of put the nail in the sand, as it were, or the bench in the sand, just to be able to understand what is my purpose in life. But I think being able to have the bigger picture on what the broader world was about, because we're such a small community, we were only really exposed to so much. Television wasn't really a thing. We listened to the radio, but I didn't really care about that at the time. I mean, I was 10, 11. And I guess the internet wasn't even a thing at the time. So our exposure at the time was really just around politics, community upliftment. And our parents and our grandparents were actively involved in that as a community to say, we're living in an environment where we've got, a massive kind of petrol refinery across the road that is owned by BP. People are dying of asthma. We don't have enough money in the community to do the basics around, sexual health care and reproduction and education. So those are the things that I was aware of. So I think in my consciousness, I knew that that's kind of the space that I wanted to be impactful in terms of being able to change and live a better life and be better for others that I impact in my life. But it wasn't necessarily something that I knew definitively I wanted to be a doctor or a psychologist or whatever it may be. I just had ambitions to get the hell out of there and make my way to the big city of Johannesburg, which I eventually did.
That's interesting. So you took the psychometric test. You were either going to be a
Yeah.
wood chipper or a veterinarian based on the test. And it sounds like you had a combination of two. You were a creator, but you also potentially could fix problems. It just didn't happen to be animals, but it was really people. That was what you
Yeah.
were passionate about.
Yeah. I think one of the eye-opening realities of just moving to a city where I'm suddenly surrounded by different people of different colors, right? So remember growing up in Durban, it was very much a marginalized city. Whereas now moving to Johannesburg, I was now in a private school. I was around white people, which I'd never been around before. I had young people who were, granddaughters and daughters and sons of politicians. I mean, Nelson Mandela used to hang out at our school on a Friday and watch football. He used to land with a helicopter. So it was suddenly being in a space where I was surrounded by worldly young people who had done amazing things at the age of 13, 14, 15. They'd been on planes, they'd gone to live overseas. They lived in New York as expats. And with that, the school was very much around you are of service to your community. So a lot of the work that we did literally from day one was working with, houses that are refuge centers for women who were working in the sex industry, people who were potentially homeless, who had drug addictions. And a lot of the work that we had to do as, I guess, volunteers was to go to those places every single Friday, plant trees, paint rooms, do the basics to help clean up those different spaces and really give back to communities in every way possible. So I guess I learned my ability to be able to be empathic and also give back to my communities in some small way, shape, or form through my high school kind of, I guess you would call it, volunteer program that I was part of. Yeah. Interesting. I never thought about it that way.
What a life experience. I feel like at such a young age to be exposed to those kinds of environments and to be able to have such an impact at such an early age on people is remarkable. Here in the States, when you go to high school, you play a sport, you may be involved in, a club here or there, but that level of giving is nothing that I've ever experienced. And just to hear you articulate how you've been able to make such an impact on people's lives at such an early age and be exposed to so many worldly things in such a short period of time, I can only imagine how that played forward with your ability to make impact in the working world, right? Like is that everyone that you interact with at school that has that opportunity, or do you have to seek that opportunity?
Well, I guess one thing that I didn't mention was that it was a mandatory. So because the school was very much rooted in community uplift, it was a Catholic school. And for the most part, any and all schools in South Africa have some sort of volunteer program, especially when you get to high school, because then you're a little bit more older. You can make the discerning decision to say, actually, I want to go and work in the sex worker space, for example, and do my bit there versus I want to go into education and work with schools where the kids don't necessarily have those resources. So that's the one thing. And then I guess in terms of our, collective consciousness around how we feel that we need to help as a society, I think it's very much entrenched in who we are as Africans. We always want to be better than what we were yesterday. And if there's a chance to help somebody in any way, small shape or form, whether it's the guy on the corner of the road that is begging for $5 to buy his next loaf of bread, or somebody on the street that needs help because their car is broken down, I think just instinctively, that's just in our nature. I mean, I'm speaking as a South African, but I think in the people that I've met over the course of my adulthood, I also recognize that it's almost the very same sentiment in Nigeria and in Kenya, for example. We call it Ubuntu, which essentially means we are responsible as a collective to uplift each other so that we all win at the end of the day, however small that deed may be. Yeah.
That's so interesting. At what point did you realize or start thinking about what you were going to pursue in college?
So here's a funny story. After I finished high school and I graduated, I did really well. I didn't necessarily realize that kind of tertiary education was the thing, but I knew that it had to be. I guess in the journey of how we move from high school into the next stage of our adulthood, that was just kind of the obvious thing. So when I started my undergrad, I knew that I wanted to dip my understanding and consciousness into psychology. So that wasn't obvious. And then I obviously took up the other subjects in humanities as well, especially international relations, because I had this grand idea that I would be a foreign policy analyst someday and stand up for the rights of Africans on a global stage.
Hmm.
And then, of course, industrial psychology was part of that mix as well. I think in the consciousness of what is the expectations and how I defined myself, that really only came in my postgrad. And what was really helpful, and I think this is probably still going to ring true today, is until you actually get some active experience in an industry of sorts, you don't really know what you want. You can learn all the academics that you really, you have access to. And I think this is probably the same for those who are doing things like, medicine as an example. I only really figured out that I loved marketing when I started doing my postgrad. So I did a junior MBA at Wits Business School. And part of that curriculum was a compulsory 3-month internship at a company of your choice. They gave us kind of like a preliminary list. And I went into probably one of the largest advertising agencies. It's a global one called Grey Worldwide. And I was handed the L'Oreal portfolio. So I got to work on their very first launch to market in South Africa for black hair care products. So the conditioners and the shampoos. And I got to work with all these amazing creators, the copywriters, creative directors, and work on what is the strategy? Like, how do you actually work on a go-to-market strategy for a product that hasn't launched before? Just such an exciting time, because remember, we've just come out of apartheid. It's the new dispensation. We're in our new democracy and everything is fresh. There's such hope for the economy. There's hope for the populace. And there's all these amazing products that are trying to kind of find new market share in the country. So that's where I really got to understand what marketing is about and what strategy means. And then how do you start finding those customers, and what is that emotional story you tell, for you to become the top of mind brand that they want to buy.
That's so interesting. When I think about how you started in industrial psychology, I feel like psychology is always the degree that sort of sets you up for success, because as I hear you talk about the idea of brand strategy and working for L'Oreal and really starting to think about how do products impact markets, and the fact that you, through your industrial psychology degree, you start to sort of develop this foundation where you understand personality styles and you understand how people are impacted by the world, whether it's individuals, whether it's, you talked about politics and culture. And so you have this real understanding about human behavior, personality styles, what people are drawn to. And the fact that you have that foundation as sort of the basis for your entree into marketing and branding, I feel like it's a great sort of base for success.
I never actually thought about it that way, largely because I tend to see things in silos, especially when it comes to my earlier formative years of decision making. But I've never underestimated the value of what the psychology portion of my tuition has really given me in terms of kind of the base, I guess, instinct to be able to apply my mind in a very specific way in terms of, the work that I do. So, I mean, to your point, it's it definitely shaped who I am as a person today. And I would, I think everybody should have a slice of psychology in their education, whether it's in high school or university or other. Just understand the human mind a bit more.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. So Bianca, how did you get into the working world, in terms of, you talked about this project with L'Oreal. How did you start to navigate these jobs, and I noticed you worked in digital marketing, you worked in PR, communications, all aspects of marketing. And I wonder, what was it about the field that lit you up and sort of propelled you into continuing down the journey of wanting to grow and learn more? What really made you feel alive and fulfilled? And then I'm curious what you didn't like.
So my first real job, post obviously studying at the business school, was actually film distribution. And I met this incredible woman at a barbecue one day. And she happened to be the only person on the continent that is responsible for the distribution of South African films onto the big screen, as well as DVD, right? This is before streaming and everything. And she was looking to kind of build out her team, and it was literally her on her own. And I joined her as the marketing manager. And one of the first projects I ever worked on was a film called Tsotsi. I don't know if it rings a bell to you. It was directed and written by Gavin Hood. It eventually won an Oscar. And I think what I loved and really what lit up my existence as a human being and also kind of solidified my passion for marketing was, one, being able to take a great idea, whether it's a script or an existing film, and work with those creators and filmmakers to package that and take it to market and do everything possible under the sun, from partnerships to bartering to leveraging resources to be able to make sure that you get that film out in every single space as possible and mobilize the public to go and literally spend their hard-earned, monies to go and buy that cinema ticket or buy that DVD. And also the culture that sits around that. So I guess beyond just the hard sales, what I really loved was the opportunities to work with, the people that did the scoring and the music and the talent that was in that film. I mean, I'll never forget the main actor, Presley, had never been on an airplane before. And for him to now go to the Oscars and go to Cannes and all of the other festivals as part of the roadshow for the film, he had such anxiety around that. So even for me, I was like, okay, I'm going to step into my little psychologist's hat now and being able to help him have a conversation with him and kind of ground him and guide him through what this amazing opportunity looks like at the end of this flight and all this amazing work that he's going to be able to do and grow his portfolio as an actor. So I did that for just under 4 years. I loved it. I got to work on comedies and series and international as well as local films, as well as Pan-African films as well, that stretched across the continent. And post that, I then cut my teeth at Viacom, so MTV Africa. So they had local channels, so the regular MTV and then the MTV base. And I was part then of that group of individuals that was responsible for all B2B and B2C marketing. So now I was basically being put in a position where how do I take what I know about marketing and this amazing entertainment package and all these channels and take that into countries like Nigeria that I hadn't been in before, and Ghana and Kenya, and work on a strategy that takes us into those markets and finds new viewers and builds kind of customer bases that we can segment and start to package solutions for other brands to want to sponsor and do activations, And that was just amazing because I guess beyond just pushing people to watching the television screens, it's also creating amazing activations that are living in these different countries that bring people together so that can also feel part of the culture that exists of the content that you're watching on screen. So, don't just give me what the Americans are talking about. I want to know what Debanj, a Nigerian musician, is making. I want to see his music video. I want to see his behind the scenes. So it's really a great entrenchment into what culture was moving within in that space in the early 2000s. And then after that, I took a little break. I started a business.
So when you left Viacom, was it intentional? Did you leave the company
Yeah.
and you said, "Hey, I'm ready to start something new"? And what was the big idea?
So let me tell you what the nail in the coffin was. So it was 2010. That was the World Cup. The World Cup was in South Africa. And at the time, I spent a total of 7 out of the 8 weeks of the World Cup hosting parties every single night as part of, the brand and what we had to do in the market, because that was one of the things that I proposed to the business at the time. And I think at that particular point, I'd reached my ceiling. There was a glass ceiling in terms of how do I move beyond this? There's only so much of I guess, finessing of the existing kind of business model that I could really push and grow and expand on versus saying, you know what, I'm at the point now where I need to do more, but I didn't know what it was. And for me, instinctively moving into the entrepreneurial space was really just a chance for me to also pivot into a space that I was really passionate about, which was obviously retail and fashion and identifying, you know, how do I really make a mark in this space? Because one, nobody's really doing it. You know, people go to markets every Saturday and Sunday and they buy their clothes and they go to retail stores, but that's just really it. And I think the defining moment for me was a trip to Thailand. And I saw how mobility really sits under pretty much every industry in that country. You know, if you go to Bangkok, everything is mobile. Your coffee, your food, you know, the goods that you buy, your curios as a tourist, a lot of it is mobile. So I took that as inspiration and came back and I was like, that's it, I'm done. I'm going to try something new. And that's how I ended up buying the truck.
I can only imagine that going to Thailand and spending that time away was, just so eye-opening in terms of you. There were several things that were happening. One is that you were away from the parties, you're away from the grind, the work. You had the opportunity to sort of kind of pull yourself out of the day to day, but you also, your mind was, really started, the wheels were spinning and you started observing how things were getting done there. And I can only imagine that when you came back, you had a renewed sense of spirit in terms of what you were really called to do. And that trip certainly gave you kind of the vision of seeing what that next opportunity would be. And ultimately, you obviously leaned into it. And you mentioned you bought a truck. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. It's the Dodge Motorhome. So we have an online marketplace. Much like you guys have in the US, where you can buy pretty much anything. And I found this Dodge Motorhome, 10.3 meters long, had a V6 engine. It was basically junked. I bought it for the equivalent of probably $300 and figured out how to ship it to Johannesburg because it was in the Cape. And at the time, remember, I hadn't even written the business plan. So I had the ideas was in my head and that was as far as it went. But I knew that was the truck that I needed to get my hands on. And I had some savings. So I bought the truck, figured out how to get it to South Africa. And ironically, at the time, we were having a transportation crisis in the country. So all the roads for kind of long haul vehicles was all kind of shut down. So I had to wait a good 2 months to get the thing into Johannesburg, but I eventually did. So the truck itself became the heart of Pumpkin Ivy because it was really just the business was built around mobility. So we would go to markets, we would go to business parks, we would go to office parks, we would go to different festivals. And that was really how we activated the garments that we made. And then also for the clients that we would do bespoke clothing for, they would come into the trucks and we would go to their different premises. And that was part of the experience. And it became such an eye-catching, I guess, narrative for a lot of the media coverage that we got because nobody at the time was even remotely using kind of mobile vehicles for anything, whether it's for food or fashion or other. So,
yeah, I love how you were figuring stuff out. It sounds like you were, you had a number of different sort of projects that you were focused on, and you ultimately landed on the product that was most appealing, but also gave you the ability to scale. What was the outcome of the business?
I also, again, I got to a point after 6 years where I was like, what is next? You know, there's only so much that I can do in terms of being, one, a producer of original garments, and two, a distributor for local designers. So one thing that I didn't mention was I also opened up our business retail space within the truck to be able to curate a lot of young designers, backpacks, arts, jewelry, whatever it may be, and also sell on their behalf. And I just got to a point after 6 years where I was like, I wonder what else I could do. And also I really want to work back in Africa again. So I kind of put it out there in my consciousness, but I didn't actively go look for anything. And when I started having those thoughts, I got a call not even 4 weeks later on from what would eventually be known as Kwese, which is a Pan-African media channel that was launched by Econet Media which was owned by a guy named Strive Masiyiwa. He's like very well known from Zimbabwe as a tech and Wi-Fi solutions giant. And I joined the company literally a month and a half, 2 months later, after I had that thought. So thoughts are things, right? They're very powerful in terms of how you put things out into the universe. The business itself, I kind of handed over to my partner and he continued with it. But I guess without my marketing and business acumen, it kind of fell to the wayside. And at the time also, I had a 3-year-old. So I was very much kind of figuring out, okay, so I have the opportunity to now work back in Pan Africa. I'm getting a consistent salary. I get to now kind of broaden my horizons because, this is a media platform. It's operating on a global scale. Yes, it's new to the continent, but the partnerships, with the NBA, with ESPN, with BBC, all of these incredible media entities that are trying to launch in the market. And I was going to be the one responsible for, one, building out what that product looks like digitally, and two, who are the partners that we pull in, to be able to create a compelling proposition for people to start consuming content on the channels that we're building beyond just the broadcast network. So, it was a no-brainer for me. I loved it.
So what I'm hearing so far, Bianca, is that the excitement of starting anew, where you have all of this opportunity to make impact through marketing, branding, PR, and it sounds like you grew your company from the truck to be a business. It sounds like it was 6 years in the making, but you were at a point where you wanted to get back into the action. It sort of feels like where this opportunity was just almost like an opportunity of a lifetime. And my question is around the system, the infrastructure of the business. That does that start to weigh on you over time, where the sort of the newness of the brands, working in the corporate world, there's sort of an underlying force that works against what you really love to do, that ultimately over time is what sort of brings you to the decision of it's time to start another company.
Absolutely. So, I guess, the compelling, idea of joining the corporate world is, you have systems and structures, you have organizations that are in place, and you've got the tools to be able to bring innovation into those. But with that also comes, I guess, a lot of restrictions in terms of how far you can really push that lever in order to really create an impact and affect change within the business. And I love how a lot of organizations always talk about how we want innovation and we want people to bring in great ideas, and your IP is meaningful because it helps us accelerate and take our products and services into spaces that we wouldn't necessarily have, the ability to do that. But, we're hiring you for your IP and we want to take you and see how you can accelerate this. But again, it does come with a number of blockers along the way because it's just the nature of corporate, right? They do have their systems in place. And I guess the innovation of how things move and how fast and the agility, I guess they are somewhat risk averse, I guess. They don't necessarily always want to be able to try out something, even if it's been very well calculated and planned and strategically documented as to how it's going to go about. As opposed to then saying, we're constantly looking at our competitors and what they're doing versus saying, actually, we're going to cut our own path. This is what it's going to look like. We're going to make a decision. We're going to put a peg in the sand, and that's what we're going to do.
Is that what happened in this opportunity that you took?
So with Kwese specifically, the company ran for just under 5 years. We had got to the point where we had built an incredible kind of free-to-air broadcast platform. I had built out the digital systems. And what eventually happened was we just ran out of funds. We just couldn't pay the licensing and the broadcast rights for, the likes of the NBA and the ESPNs, for example, because those are really expensive, right? But in order for you to be able to monetize that stuff, you need to build out an ecosystem. And an ecosystem does require some time to be able to build out, that 20 million eyeballs that you want on a daily basis that is going to come into your platform and watch your content so that you can start to monetize that to advertisers. So I guess we did put the cart before the horse. And I'm saying that from the business point of view.
At what point in your job search did you discover TikTok as a company and as a potential employer to work for?
So I was actually in Fintech before TikTok. So I was working for a platform first business. And my focus there was purely on digital content. So I was working within the Center of Excellence across the group. And I got a call and an email actually from TikTok in the UK office, I think it was. And they were like, we saw your profile on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and we'd love to have a conversation with you. So, in their very aggressive way of going to find talent, they managed to find me. And I went through the interview process, and it was an incredibly compelling idea. And to be able to be the person responsible for setting up what that future of African operations looks like. How do we scale content and build ecosystems and build community and, design education programs that are of benefit to, brands and publishers and creators, and work with local regulators and telcos and MNOs. Like, there's so many vast pieces that sat within that. So it was absolutely a compelling proposition. And again, a lot of the work that I learned from the broadcast/Kwese business was working with telcos. So I took a lot of that experience and obviously plugged it into the relationships that I already had within the work that I did with TikTok. So it was an absolute no-brainer for me. I got to build out a great team of 25 people. It was great.
Yeah, it's so interesting how, when you think about how global brands come together with just average people, and how it could just take a 30-second video that puts a brand or gives them a new market channel. And with your background, I can only imagine the sort of the white space that you had in terms of just creating something new. And what an opportunity. What was your biggest challenge in terms of bringing such a new brand to Africa?
I guess one is the concerns around misinformation and information being badly spread on the platforms. And especially from a government regulator's point of view, they have a lot of concerns around, how are you managing and regulating and checking what content is being published that is speaking ill about my political party, as an example. So that would be one. The other piece is, I guess, just in the conversations with a lot of the media partners and the publishers that we had on the platform, their understanding that it's a dance and music platform. So what was Musical.ly at the time versus where TikTok obviously was in the last 2 years, where, longer format content. People want to watch content. They want to be educated. It's all around edutainment and spending longer time on the platform. So it's having a conversation with them and saying, no, we're not expecting your marketing team to dance and show a credit card. It's about, what is that value that you're trying to sell in terms of why they should have that credit card and how it's going to help their lives be a little bit better in terms of their financial literacy and their well-being. So that was the one. I think the other piece is probably also just, getting into the different countries was an easy part because, again, it's a creator-led platform, I think once people find their identity in a platform where they feel heard and seen, they're able to express themselves. And I guess in how that movement kind of snowballed across the continent, that happened just by the nature of, one person telling another, and then the creators start to push that forward. So access isn't necessarily the difficult thing. It's more around the brands that are somewhat, how do I put this nicely? Kind of antiquated in their understanding of the value of the platform for what they need to do and where that next gen customer sits, right?
So was your responsibility to create the infrastructure where companies that were more traditional in terms of media saw opportunities to promote their brand through the platform?
Yes. So from an operations point of view, my mandate was, one, to grow the eyeballs on the platform, two, to be able to really grow out a healthy content ecosystem that's not just dancing, right? So how do we create more content that is African-centric around films and TV and music and arts and culture and food, right? And many other different content pillars. So building out a robust content ecosystem. And then alongside that, who are the creators that we would work in each of the different countries to be able to then be the ones that are responsible for publishing the content that is around food and fashion and music, etc. And then alongside that is the brands and the media partners who are not fully optimizing the channel, So for example, taking on my film hat from back in the day, it's working with kind of the leading production companies in Nigeria, for example. Nollywood is the second biggest film industry outside of Hollywood globally. They produced a massive amount of films, but they weren't necessarily leveraging the platform to be able to work with TikTok as a channel of choice for their full kind of production life cycle. So what does that mean when you're on set versus when the content's ready, when you're going to push the content out? People go to cinemas to watch the film, the actors that are involved in. How do you create a movement around Nollywood, right? As a production company owner, or as a filmmaker, as an independent, for example. So it is a lot of that work. And then within that, I guess, comes the numbers that you can then obviously hand over to the sales team. And they'll be the ones that I'm now saying, okay, we can monetize it. There's a robust community that sits in Nigeria that is interested in finance. Let's package this for the banking sector as ad revenue.
That's so interesting. I was just thinking back to your days at MTV and how traditional that media was. You're watching a 3-minute or 3.5-minute music video to now on a television, by the way, and now you're producing content that's, seconds over a digital device, and how that journey has evolved, but also impacted your career. And it's fascinating.
It blows my mind because, when you talk about how, people are consuming content in just seconds, the attention economy is now the most expensive thing that everybody wants to get their hands on. And whilst we know that things are moving at a fast and accelerated rate, people are spending a lot more time watching longer format content. I mean, if you think about just podcasts and vodcasts and I guess just the streaming platforms across the globe, whilst we have shorter attention spans, we're still spending a lot more time watching pieces of longer format content. So I guess to your point around the shortness of it, we actually are expanding how we're digesting and learning, as just a global community in terms of what we consume on our phones.
Yeah, it definitely has a variety. I find myself, I'll watch shorts for a good period of time, but when I'm spending time outside walking or in the yard, I'll put on a good hour and a half podcast where, you're really absorbing a whole scope of content that impacts something that you're doing in your life. And I love that. I love the learning from something very focused, but I also like to have my mind, sort of, trail into the ether, into something completely different. So Bianca, I'm curious, what led you to leaving TikTok?
Globally, there is a lot of shifts within the business prioritization. And I mean, I'm sure you've seen in the media. So yes, there is the impending ban within the US. And a lot of that came to, I guess, the business making the decision that they were going to, I guess, shut down a lot of the operational functions, the marketing functions, and reduce a lot of the capabilities. Because again, it's a tech-driven platform, so there are other ways that you can work around providing certain solutions. I think, again, it's about recognizing that a lot of the foundation work had been done. We'd built trust in the markets. There's a healthy ecosystem. There is a robust and active community that is logging on every single day and spending a minimum of 90 minutes a day. So all of that becomes equity for the business, which they can essentially automate or do whatever they need to do down the line. So my journey of moving on into entrepreneurship, again, it just made perfect sense. I've kind of learned everything that is necessary in terms of what I've taken from TikTok, as well as other platform businesses, as well as my background in media and marketing. And now just identifying where we find ourselves as a marketing fraternity, both within the continent and more so, especially in South Africa, because I spend a lot of time speaking to different brand custodians, whether they're C-suites or just, kind of marketing managers, and as well as agencies, and we're in that very finite space where there's such a profound amount of work that needs to be done to change the way that we are packaging messaging for customers across the board. So we talk about digital transformation all the time, but what does that practically mean? So we've got ad agencies on the one end that are quite rigid in terms of their business models. They're known for creating long ads, TV ads, and, all the kind of above the line media solutions that they're doing to service a brand because that's part of their retainer. And that's all good and well, but the customers are not necessarily there. We're living on a continent where roughly 60% of the world's youth is going to only be living in Africa in the next 4 years, right? And that's an astounding number. If you think about the opportunity size for how we are mismatching the efforts we're doing from a marketing point of view and the customers that we're trying to reach. They're not looking at billboards, they're not looking at traditional television. They're not necessarily listening to the radio. They're on devices consuming content in either closed wall ecosystems such as, AI apps, or on the likes of Spotify as an example, or sitting on TikTok where they're spending 90 minutes a day. So there is a massive kind of gap between what that looks like and how do we practically then start to affect and fix what those problems are to be able to, one, mobilize the teams that are working in the agencies to develop clearer kind of defined content strategies and kind of long forward thinking strategies with the brand owners and get them to understand that, you should be spending at least 60% of your budget on digital, not the other way around on above the line, right? Because that's where your customers are.
I want to comment on how from such an early age, you were on the front line of bringing media to people all throughout Africa. And I love how over your journey, you've aligned with companies and brands in order to create, produce, message content for people all across the continent. I think that's so remarkable. And all the way through to TikTok, whether, in your background's digital transformation, and you talked about digital transformation, but you've transformed as a person throughout your entire career. I just find it fascinating that, as I hear your story, you are literally on the front line of media and content being curated to people all across the continent. I just think that's so fascinating.
Right. And I guess when I first started the idea of content curation, which was when I was in broadcast media, at the time I was like, if we were to develop this incredible platform where we curate the African internet, one, because it doesn't exist, and two, because Google stuff is everywhere, right? But there's incredible kind of content creators and bloggers and owners of different content platforms that are really capturing culture in the most niche, kind of subsegments of societies that are not necessarily being elevated. And I guess kind of taking that hat and the curation of the work that I did versus where I find myself in the tech space within TikTok, and then also within where we are now within the digital transformation space. Yeah, I guess I was ahead of the curve at the time. It just kind of made sense though, I think you would never really define what that single anchor is that really will find your customer. We always talk about contextual marketing and finding the customer where they're at, but until you really kind of cast your net across all the categories that are interest points for the human psyche and where you find them, it's important, that you dive into what the interest points are of those subcultures and the things that people are interested in, because how else do you know how to capture that into your messaging in order to sell your products or services, right?
I love that. You're absolutely right. So tell me about the Fixer Coalition. How did you start the company? It sounds like TikTok and the restructuring that happened there was almost the catalyst that allowed you to step back into the entrepreneurial world. How did you come up with the idea? And tell me about the Fixer Coalition.
Yeah, so I guess looking at just my history, right? So massive love and appreciation for the value of culture, right? Massive appreciation and expertise in terms of what content looks like across different platforms. And then working with platforms themselves, whether it's TikTok or Instagram, LinkedIn, whatever it may be. I also recognize there was a lot of work to be able to start working with brands because there's a lot of opportunity in terms of how they are playing within those spaces, right? I know that traditional advertising and above the line budgets and working with different brands, they kind of have their formulas. They know that they're going to get the engagement rates and the view rates and all of those metrics if they put 70% of their budget into 4 TV commercials a year, running kind of paid media strategies on the likes of their Google dashboards that will help with their digital transformation and maturity. But that isn't necessarily where the customers are now. So, and also understanding that when we have potentially 60% of the world's youth living in Africa in the next 4 years, the customers are there. And the services and the offerings that you're trying to take to market, if you're not speaking to that next gen, you're wasting all of your efforts and you're not necessarily going to meet what you need for your bottom line in order to drive profits for the company. So I had this idea to basically say, I've taken the learnings that I've learned from TikTok when it comes to working with media brands, right? And publishers who are trying to penetrate that space that don't necessarily know how. And they need a couple of things. One is educating their teams on how to use the platform. Just the bare basics. Just the bare basics. So what does it mean in order to now look at a new platform? It's not new. TikTok's been around for like roughly 3.5, 4 years in the continent. So, but they're not necessarily optimizing it efficiently. So because I know organically what should be done in order to very quickly scale and grow that, there's that piece. The second piece is around what does cross-channel ownership for these brands look like? So yes, you have your above the line, you've got your TV ad, but no, your TV ad should not be on your TikTok. That's not the place for it. So in your strategy for what your digital strategy is going to be for your brand, I help them obviously put that together. We do audits around, what does their YouTube channel look like? What does their Instagram channel look like? What does their TikTok look like? Do they even have a TikTok account? Where is their kind of core customer base is sitting in? And what does that mean in terms of how we design a future forward strategy for them that encompasses platforms, content, building community, right? Because that's the important thing. How do you build an audience organically that you can start to serve your full funnel kind of metrics to? And then I guess outside of that, it's also standing and hanging your hat on a purpose, right? Because we're at that point now where customers and people just generally, I will buy into your brand if I know what you're about, what your values and your principles are about, and if you're doing any good in the world, right? So like Nike, for example, I think they will always win because we know for a fact that even in South Africa, they've painted most of the basketball courts that people go onto. They do a lot of community work. They invest in community halls and people go and play basketball and create safe spaces. And yes, they have incredible ranges of sneakers that people want to go and buy because they feel like they've been seen as a community by the brand. And that's the consciousness that I'm also trying to shift with a lot of these kind of brand owners, these C-suites, as well as these agencies. So it's finding that gap to be able to drive platform, content optimization, building community, and leveraging culture. And what does that look like in the strategies that we build in partnership with them? And get them into the room, right? Because a lot of them work separately. Generally there's just a brief that gets sent off to the agency and then they need to figure it out. And then at some point they come and brief it back. But that's not necessarily taking into account who the customers are, the insights and the data, cultural impacts, and all of those other indicators that these 60% of the youth populace is that we're trying to speak to.
That's fascinating. I love the title, The Fixer Coalition. And I can only think about from the beginning, you're in high school, you're volunteering your time in communities in a variety of different things. And the word coalition almost sort of summarizes your entire career. And you brought it forward from the time you were very young through working for these large brands, buying the truck, making the fabrics, creating the content. And I feel like you have the recipe for just a fantastic future, which is ultimately helping companies put all of these things together in a way that brings goodness to the world.
Exactly. And that's my mission, literally. And I'm sure at some point I'll make the decision because I really am also passionate about the education sector. And that's another thing that needs a lot of help, especially in South Africa, because we're in a massive crisis with teachers. But I also want to just get to the point where I can empower these brands to be able to set themselves up for what this future state of marketing is going to look like, because it needs to happen in the next 6 months to a year. That's how urgent it is. And then alongside that, my do good is then going to work in the education sector, because there's a lot of work to be done in the robotic space and upliftment for communities to be able to help young kind of preschool and primary school kids live a better life and be equipped for what this digital workforce is going to be that everybody's so scared about with AI.
So Bianca, what's the best way people can find you?
Okay, so Instagram, The Fixer Co. On TikTok, my account on TikTok is actually not business related. So I'm also a massive advocate for people who are neurospicy, aka the ADHD community. So I do a lot of content there just on life as a woman, late diagnosed, neurospicy brains. So no content there around The Fixer, but the handle is ironically called The Fixer.
Thank you so much for joining today. I just absolutely loved our conversation. And I have to say, I learned a lot about a lot of things. I love the story about the truck. Yeah. I love the stories about how you made such an impact in high school across a number of different areas. Loved hearing the story about your grandparents taking care of you growing up as a kid. Didn't learn too much about your sibling, but really, really enjoyed our conversation here today. And thank you again.
Thank you. This has been amazing. It's quite nice having a virtual therapist to put my life together in a little bit of a timeline. It's great to hear it. I appreciate it. And thanks for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoyed it. And thanks everyone for listening. Until next time. Hello, Raymond again here. Thank you so much to our sponsor, Careerminds, a global provider of outplacement and career development services. And if you'd like to connect with me about your own personal journey, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, as well as find me on Instagram at raymondlee.co. Until next time, remember, if you're stuck or unsure of your career or future, and you think it's time for a change, I would ask yourself these 3 questions. Does my career or work make me feel alive? Am I doing the things that matter to me most? And am I creating value for myself and for others? Until next time.